guys don't like each other. All right, I want to say at the outset that this session is not a sales pitch. I will be using a product to do the whole document management stuff at the end when we need to get paper into our library. But I don't work for Digitech. I don't work for Microsoft. They just make me wear this shirt. Don't you wish you had one of these cool shirts, huh? All right, my name is Raymond Wasner. My company is Calabria. And what we do is we educate business executives about the business value of SharePoint. So that means, line of business IT, that means business management, how to get more out of SharePoint, how to use SharePoint in a more effective way, how to treat SharePoint basically as a web application platform, which is really what it is. So we're going to do this session here in two parts. To be honest, for me to tell you how to do effective business document management with SharePoint would take me all day, okay? Because there's many, many facets to it. So I am not an MVP. I'm not here to sell you a book. I don't live in Hawaii. I've never bicycled up to Mount Everest. I don't scuba dive with sharks. But I did stay at Holiday Inn Express last night. So what I have been doing for 27 years is helping people manage business documents. I did that with FileNet. I did that with Documentum. I did that with OpenText. I did that with basically everybody in this business. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I drank the Microsoft Kool-Aid, the SharePoint Kool-Aid more specifically, on a project with Microsoft where they said, hey, how can we position SharePoint better in the ECM space, the Enterprise Content Management space? I go, what do you mean? It is an enterprise content management platform. They said, yeah, but, how can we position it better against these other products? So we took a really deep look into what it is and what it does. And we concluded, 2003 didn't do really very much. 2007 was a huge improvement. 2010 was an enormous improvement. So we said, yeah, let's do that. So we started to take apart SharePoint and look at it, from a business functionality point of view. Obviously, you have to look at technology in order to do that. But the trick is translating that technology to meet business requirements, okay? And by requirements, I don't mean 8 gigs of RAM in a workstation, okay? I mean that the company has valuable business documents that it needs to protect or share or in some way manage in an organized fashion, and SharePoint gets you there. And SharePoint pretty much gets you there in the same way that anything else that costs a lot more money does. So we're going to do this session in two parts. The first part is kind of a high-level overview. We do seminars all over the country. We call them our SharePoint for Business series, and we invite people into the Microsoft offices in all of the major sales districts that Microsoft operates in. So if you want to see some of this stuff again, send people to one of those. We do it pretty much 2 or 3 times a year. What we've learned from that experience in terms of talking to business people is that none of them are exactly thrilled with their SharePoint. They can't find stuff. Things are poorly organized. They seem to think that what they're looking at on the screen is really all that SharePoint is able to do. And that's completely wrong. You guys know you're controlling what they see on the screen. We also found that people in general, not to be critical, but people in general don't really have a good comprehensive view of exactly what SharePoint is. So I'm going to do this session in 2 parts. I'm going to start with thinking about SharePoint as a business platform. And then the second part is we're going to delve into some specifics related to how you do document management. And as I said earlier, I can't really tell you, click here and presto, you get document management. It's something you have to think about. I also can't cover all of the subjects that relate to it, but I'm happy to answer questions. And by the way, the rules of engagement for this session are very simple. You may ask any question anytime, right? So just shout it out, raise your hand, do something. I may not see you because my peripheral vision can't cover this entire room. Now, let's look at SharePoint as a platform. What is it really? So I've spent 30-something years in high tech. I mean, I had built my first computer when I went to UC Berkeley. I bought parts for an IM-size. Anybody even know what that is? Some of you younger people in the room? Okay. So that's, when I got into computing. And I was a senior vice president at Forrester Research for a while before I started my own company, which is what this is. When I looked at SharePoint, and that coupled with everything that's going on in terms of major technology trends or information management trends out there, SharePoint is definitely part of collaborative enterprise computing. That's what us analysts call that whole genre, right? So instead of stovepiping information and sticking it all in one place, you want to be able to distribute the parts of it to the users in order to make the business more productive. That's the whole goal. So, stovepiping stuff away so that people can't use it is not really effective information management in the modern enterprise. So SharePoint is definitely the next step in information management. I don't look at it as a social platform. I don't look at it as something that I can email a file into. There's lots of things that do that. It's what else you can do with it, okay? It is nothing less than the next step in information management. It's an enterprise-wide platform. It exists everywhere in the company, and it has the ability to share, organize, distribute, discover information of any kind and bring it directly to the desktop and make it relevant to that user. Those are its core capabilities. There is nothing on earth like that. There is nothing that does that. In 30-something years, I've never seen anything that can do that. So this is the beginning of a whole new thing. So it's a big deal. Collaborative enterprise computing systems are typically technologies that go beyond file systems. You know what a file system is? Your D drive, the files and folders and all that jazz. That is really an ancient idea, files and folders. Files and folders came out when people were using 8-inch floppy disks with 128 kilobytes of information on them. And you could put 8 folders and maybe 16 documents on one of these disks, and that was called the desktop metaphor. That's when files and folders came along. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that when you have terabyte drives free with a tank of gas, that files and folders are no longer the effective way to manage information. Basically, the computer file system, the C drive, the D drive, the library that shows you modified by, and the date, that was invented 35 years ago. Why are we still doing that today, right? So SharePoint eliminates the file system. It is I'm doing Jimi Hendrix thing here. It eliminates your reliance on people filing things in their own individual way. It allows you to put the information into a database. And when it's in that database, it becomes manageable in a wide variety of ways. And SharePoint has lots and lots of features that allow you to do that. So what we're talking about here is delivering productive interaction with files and data directly to any desktop in the company. So theoretically, what you should be able to do with SharePoint is get the right information to the right people at the right time under the right circumstances. It's built as a universal platform that reaches across your entire enterprise around the world, and it can do that. Now that means it's not necessarily simple to work with, right? That capability comes at a cost. So here's my, early morning, are you awake yet question. Does anybody know how many pages the SharePoint 2010, and by the way, this is probably the only session where you're actually going to see the SharePoint that you're using today, not the one that everybody wants you to use. So how many pages long is the manual? How many people say A? SharePoint manual's A. Come on. B. All right. C. How many people say C? All right. How many people say D? It is 12,351 pages. Now, I know you're all here because you read it all cover to cover, right? So anything that I'm going to say you already know about because you read the entire manual, right? And you will have also discovered that the manual is not terribly useful. For example, let's say that you wanted to use the metadata term store in the managed metadata service. So you go to M in the manual, and it says metadata term store. Click here, click there, there you go. Okay? Now, from a techie point of view, okay, that's fine. You told me where to go. Now, what's the real question here? What are the terms that I put in it? How do I do a taxonomy, right? What are my requirements for this term store? How do I meet those requirements? How do I deploy it? How do I break it up into little pieces and give different departments, their own taxonomy structure that they can use? That's not in the manual, okay? So, the best description of SharePoint that I've ever heard from anybody, because came from Steve Ballmer himself when SharePoint 2010 was introduced. He said, and I don't know why this isn't on every box, since SharePoint doesn't come in a box. SharePoint is a general-purpose platform for connecting people with information. That really says it all, right? It's a general-purpose platform for connecting people with information. What does that mean? General purpose. What does that mean to you, general purpose? Well, I'm guessing it means you think that it doesn't do everything, but it's always relevant, right? It's a general purpose tool. Like a Swiss Army knife is a general purpose tool, right? It's not a good machete, and it's not even a good toothpick, but it's a general purpose tool. So it's always relevant, it's something you can always use, and it's always there. The other part is the word platform. Now, one of the things I find in talking to users of SharePoint or business managers that want to use SharePoint, what I find from those people is that they think SharePoint is an application. That's why they think it's 100 pages. And it blows them out of their seats when you tell them it's over 10,000 pages. Now, that's very natural for them to assume that because they judge SharePoint by what they see on the screen. And what they see on the screen is basically decided by some administrator. Has nothing to do with the business value of SharePoint by itself. So he said it's a platform. I believe it's a platform. You should believe it's a platform. It is definitely not an application, although a lot of the demos and whatnot that I've seen over the last few days seem to suggest that it is not. Connecting people with information, hey, that's the game. That's why we buy all this stuff, right? That's why we invest in all this technology. That's why we buy the databases, the PCs, the LANs, the web infrastructure. It's to get information to people, right? So shouldn't that be the primary goal of how you work with SharePoint? Shouldn't that be, how do I get to that information? Where do we come from? Okay? We come from a world that is basically that. Client-server computing. So you have a PC, that PC connects to a network, that network connects to file servers, you have an application running on the file server, you have a fat application running on the PC, the two talk to each other, and that's how the world of computing came along for the last 30 years. That's basically what we have been doing for as long as I've been in it. So for 30 years, if you forgot something, you had to drive back to the office to fix it because it was on your PC and it was only accessible there. Sure, laptops made that go away to some extent, but you still had to VPN into the office system to do your work there. That's clearly not the world we work in anymore. I mean, I'm walking around with dirty word here, but Unix on a phone, all right? I can tell you that that was not possible. You know, you needed something that would dim the lights in this room 30 years ago to give you that level of computing power that we now have in our pocket. Same with tablets and all that other good stuff. What happened in the mid-90s is a little thing called the browser came along, and it was extremely disruptive. The reason it was extremely disruptive is because while the browser was a fat application that ran on a computer in your office, it could reach into another world. And what it could do out there in that world, it was apart from that file server, application server infrastructure that we have in the organization, it gave you the ability to communicate with websites. The interesting thing about that is that they're really not websites. How many of you think Amazon is a website? It's really a web application, isn't it? Right? A website is if I look up, you know, the documentation for my Whirlpool washer dryer. It's fresh on my mind. I got a call this morning. We need a new washer dryer. Anyway, so the browser can bypass this entire architecture. So the websites were rapidly becoming applications in and of themselves. They weren't just really static pages that were put up for somebody to look at. They were interactive applications. See, my definition of a web application is that if I interact with it, it's an app. It's not a site. If I'm just looking at something and I'm just reading what's on the screen and maybe printing it, whoever does that still, that is a website. But everything else is a web application. And in fact, my bank customizes the website, which is really an application, to my needs. It's my web application. It's the same general technology that you use at Bank of America, but it is mine. It's customized to me. It's my information. I get to decide how it looks. So it's clearly not a site. It's an application. Obviously, this whole browser thing is a big threat to that computing infrastructure that we've been using for the last 30 years. So, what SharePoint is a technology that has been put into place to essentially replace that whole client-server thingamajiggy. Okay? SharePoint gives your company the ability to internetify your stuff. In other words, what used to be stuck in all these different stovepipes and all these different servers with all these different client applications can now be moved through the use of this general purpose platform to distribute that information, to connect people with information. That's what SharePoint is for. So the whole deal is to take the stuff that you really want users to have in the various different departments, put it into this SharePoint framework, and deliver it to them in that way. The good news is you can deliver that to any device that has a browser. It's not a PC anymore. It's not even Windows anymore. I know that's blasphemy, but it isn't. Okay? It's about the browser. So I want to be able to, in the future, in my enterprise, to deliver information to any browser that works for my company. So that's a completely and fundamental change in information management. What does a SharePoint platform do? Well, it does several things. Number one, it comes with a content model. That's our word. Nobody ever talks about that. It has an infrastructure, a very powerful infrastructure to organize, classify, and manage content. The funny part about it is that ability is turned off when you throw it over the fence to the users. So the SharePoint default setting is to have no content model. So everything that you're using in SharePoint today, all the default templates assume that everything you're going to put in it is crap. There is no management capability turned on whatsoever. That is the out-of-the-box default setting. Now, that's not an evil thing, right? Microsoft doesn't know what your company does or yours or anyone else in the room. They don't know what your users do. You barely know what your users do, right? So they can't really make any assumptions about that. So the very first actionable thing that you should take home from this session is that the SharePoint that you're using, if you have not modified the content model, the SharePoint you're using does not perform any document management at all. Okay? Now, what is the most common document that you guys have in your inventory? Is it a .doc, is it a PowerPoint, or is it a PDF? Right? It's a PDF. SharePoint can't search PDFs. You need to install a third-party tool called iFilter from Adobe to be able to do that. So every one of your users that's dropping a PDF into a library, it's not retrievable by search. You have to modify the content model to be able to do that. Now, how often do you think that's happening in your company every day? SharePoint also comes with a very powerful integration layer. As a general-purpose platform to connect people with information, it has the ability to reach outside itself to other data sources, bring those data sources into the content model, and distribute them accordingly. So that means that if you've got your SAP out there and the chief cook and bottle washer in your company wants to see a pie chart on his SharePoint portal in the morning of sales coming in from around the world, you can bring that information in, put it into a content type, apply it to the page, use some of the Power Pivot tools, and give them the pie chart, which changes in real time. So as the data updates in SAP, will update in his pie chart. That's a gee-whiz-bang use of SharePoint. But that's just an example of how SharePoint can reach outside its own infrastructure to get information from external sources. Workflow. SharePoint also comes with the ability to utilize workflow. It has an engine embedded in it, which is now up in the sky, but it has an engine embedded in it called the Workflow Foundation that gives you the ability to create many, many different powerful workflows. What you don't get with SharePoint out of the box is the ability to properly manipulate those. You have to use programming tools like Visual Studio. You have to use SharePoint Designer. Like usual throwaway line on that is if you ever use Designer, you'll wish you to build a workflow, you'll wish you were dead. So Designer, to build a workflow, it's not an effective tool. So that's why the no-brainer for most people is to use something like Nintex that harvests those tools from, or K2 or AgilePoint, AgilePoint actually doesn't do that, that harvests the capabilities that SharePoint has, but gives you a way to design and develop workflows and apply them directly to your document libraries. SharePoint comes with search. 2007 was a terrible search. 2010 was better search. 2013 is pretty terrific search. Now, if I was to teach you everything that search in SharePoint did, it would probably take me 2 days because it is so powerful. It is all over the place in terms of inside, and there is nothing that you can do with search without first understanding what the user's requirements are for finding stuff. That's, in the end of the day, the most important thing, right? How will users, how do they want to find? That means the crawlers have to be specified. If there's metadata, you have to turn the search on to be able to find metadata. There's a lot to configure as search. From a document management point of view, search should not be the only way that people retrieve information. A, because it's resource intensive. B, because it finds stuff that people don't really want or need. So the most accurate and effective way to find information in SharePoint is with metadata. Right? If I'm vendor number 007, if I'm looking for the invoice from 007, that's a hit. Right? I don't have to search anything. When I'm on the phone with a customer and they give me their vendor number, I should be able to look at my SharePoint library without having to execute a search to find that invoice. Metadata does that kind of thing. The metadata capability of SharePoint is turned off for all of the default applications. I'll show you that in a minute. So because SharePoint puts all the information in the database, there's really no copying of stuff. There's no moving stuff. There is no duplicating stuff. It's in there once. And what happens is that it's surfaced to whoever needs it. So visibility of the file, let's talk about that, is either turned on or off for users. You're not giving them another file and putting in their libraries. There are no folders in SharePoint. Now you may be saying, wait a minute, Ray, we know there's folders because when we look at the ribbon, there's a folder right there. Well, I'm here to tell you that's a lie. There is no folder, okay? That folder is just there to keep people from freaking out, to think that they're organizing stuff in folders just like they always did. Right? That is not what happens. It's in a database, okay? There is no folder. The folder is there to organize the 10,000 documents that you have in your list so that you don't have to look at 10,000 at a time. It's a visual thing. It has nothing to do with the organization. It has nothing to do with copying files to a folder. None of that conventional desktop activity happens inside SharePoint. Now, everybody talks about SharePoint in sites, but I think in terms of communicating with users or beginning to understand how user business requirements and how to translate those into the SharePoint technology, we consistently recommend to people that they should not use the word sites. Every interaction that a user has with SharePoint is with a web app. You are giving them a web app. Whether you're turning on a default library, you're letting them do that, here's your library, go nuts, do whatever you want, that is not a site, that's an app. Because you're interacting with it. You can manipulate it. You can move things around in it. It is like my Bank of America implementation. It's a web app. It's customized to my purposes, but it's still a web app. It's not just a site. Now, when you start thinking like that and say, well, SharePoint, if it is a web app toolkit, which is another phrase we use, if it really is a web app toolkit, then I forgot, what was I going to say? Jeff? Okay. It's a web app toolkit, so it immediately brings into mind that if I'm giving an application to a user, I need to know what their requirements are. So I need to know what it is that they want to accomplish, because that's how you build apps, right? When I go to Bank of America to check my balances and my accounts, the bank needs to know what I want to see, not what they want me to see, right? What do I want to see? So there's that immediate connection when you think of creating a library that you're really letting users build an app. The question of requirements immediately comes into play. How are you going to use it? How are you going to find it? How are you going to secure it? How are you going to control it? Those are all the issues that come into play. How do they retrieve the information? What is it that they look at first? What's the most important thing if you're processing an invoice or if you're processing a purchase order? All of those things. Okay? So most people, immediately recognize this and say, well, this is SharePoint, right? Now, take a look at this thing and take a real critical look at it. I deliberately made all the links in red just to give you the idea of how much overwhelming and useless information is automatically delivered by a library. Right? So a particular favorite of mine is that modified is information that a user can use. Why is that modified column there? When the user's on the phone with a customer and says, I'm looking for your invoice, do they ask the customer, when was it modified? Right? Do they say, who was it modified by? Is that useful information? Right? I'm sorry, that invoice, was that a PDF, a PowerPoint, or a doc? Is that useful information? Is that how the users would retrieve information from SharePoint? So this is the out-of-the-box way in which SharePoint presents information, because it makes certain assumptions about what the lowest common denominator of user would want to see in a library. None of those assumptions are relevant in your line of business in any way, shape, or form. This is also SharePoint. I don't know about you, but I like this a whole lot better. Right? So if I had to interact with SharePoint, never mind the car, okay, it is a pretty cool website. Now, that's a public-facing website, but what do you think the odds are that users would use this or would use that? Now, if you use your imagination here for a minute and say, okay, well, wait a minute, we are, let's pretend this is a finance department, right? And in that finance department, you got people who are working with expense reports, with purchase orders, with invoices, with a wide variety of things. Do you think they will be happy campers working with this? Or would they much rather have something like that? Right? Now, you saw at the keynote, right, if you saw it, there's all kinds of things that you can do with style sheets now in a new version of SharePoint to make it easier to build this kind of thing. I don't know, these guys probably killed themselves for 6 or 7 months to put that together. That's a little easier to do. But if I had a pointer, or do I have one? I do. Okay, what you really see on the page there is a bunch of little web parts. Now, shouldn't those little web parts in there, those little icons, also be in this library so that I'm able to sort that library by vendor number or by invoice date or by invoice amount, that I can quickly find the information I'm looking for without utilizing search? And to make it a whole lot more interactive. Could have a smiling face of the CFO in the upper hand corner. Please give me your expense reports. I can't wait to pay them. That kind of thing. That makes the whole interaction with this, for the user, a whole lot more like my interaction with Bank of America, okay? Or Amazon, or anything or Giftly, or anything that I frequently use on the internet. How many Harry Potter fans in the room? Okay, good. Nobody else will admit it, right? Okay. So, my son he's in college now, but he was into this big time. So into it that, in fact, he would listen to one book on tape while he was reading another. Right? I don't know how he does that. He's not that smart. I don't know what he was doing. But, so I hear these things, Diagon Alley, Mirror of Erised. The Mirror of Erised, if you're not a Harry Potter fan, which apparently most of you aren't, the Mirror of Erised is a mirror that's up in the attic in Hogwarts. And Harry's not supposed to go up there and look at it because it's not the typical kind of mirror. It's not a mirror that shows you what's there. It's a mirror that shows you what you want to be there. So until I made this slide, I didn't realize that Erised was desire backwards. And then I started thinking about a whole bunch of things like diagonally. Okay? The book is full of stuff like that, which I have an advanced degree in linguistics. I helped design the world's first handheld talking translator. So I get a kick out of stupid lexical stuff like this. So it occurred to me, I said, wait a minute, SharePoint is like the Mirror of Erised. Because depending on who you are and what your role is, you're going to see what you want to see. You're not going to see what it really is. What you're going to see is what you want it to be. So if you are a developer, that's going to be crack your knuckles time. Holy cow, look at the stuff that I can do. This is a green field. Well, there's two kinds of developers. The kind that say, boy, this is stupid. Why did they do this? And there's the other kind that says, boy, this is great. I don't have to do this. So I probably was the former time in my day. But so developers view SharePoint as something you develop stuff in. Okay, well, what do you want? You want this to bounce up and down? You want this to scroll across the page? What do you want it to do? I got the tools to do it. In fact, the tools are so powerful that you can actually undo SharePoint itself. You could bring it right down to just being a bunch of databases. Right? If you're a user, it's whatever the ribbon is in front of you, whatever's been provisioned for you when that library is turned on. So that's your view of SharePoint. You don't know it's a general purpose platform for delivering information, right? What you know is what you see. Gee, I wonder what happens if I hit this button. That's the user view. The administrator view is a different view. A bunch of switches that they can turn on and off. Tick me off one more time about how slow search is, and it's gone. I'll take it right out of that thing. You don't like search? Guess what? No search, right? So that's the power of the administrator. The power of the administrator is to, their view is that I can turn things on and off in SharePoint. What the world really sorely needs to develop in the SharePoint arena to really maximize its potential as a business tool is a business understanding of what those features and capabilities are. It's not that you can do all these things with SharePoint, okay? It's what you do with it, and it's how you do it. So if you look at things like Content Organizer, well, that's something that you either turn on or off. Well, no, it's a very powerful tool for automatically organizing information in your SharePoint. Now, without that understanding, without a business view of this thing, a holistic view of everything that SharePoint offers the business, you can't really effectively function with it. Now, to be sure, there's lots of issues to stand it up and to get it running. There's also lots of issues to make it meaningful and useful for users. And it's my belief that the best way to do that is to understand their needs, understand their requirements, understand what it is that users are trying to accomplish with this masterful platform. Okay? What is it that they want to do? Sure, there's a lot of straight out-of-the-box stuff. I want to socialize. I want to be able to have a place to put my junk. That kind of stuff it does out of the box. But there's also an institutional purpose. There's also a business purpose. The business didn't buy SharePoint so users could screw around and send Twitter messages to each other. That's not the purpose of the thing, right? There's a whole lot more to it than that. So it has to have a value to the business. So the business needs to understand that this is a general purpose platform that can be used to meet a wide variety of user needs in a very effective way, if you understand the requirements of the user. Now, here's where the SharePoint Catch-22 comes into play. Okay? The users don't know what SharePoint does, therefore they can't give you the requirements, right? So you have the SharePoint technology architects that know all about servers, that know all about requirements, that know all about resources, that know all about SQL clustering, that know all about those kinds of things. But what does that mean to the business? How do I translate those capabilities and technologies to the business? That is why we created the SharePoint Business Professional. You need to look at that technology from the point of view of the requirements. So if you're talking to users and you're communicating with them and you're looking at the requirements that they have, the effective use of SharePoint depends on you being able to translate those requirements into the technology. So you want to be in the middle of that Venn diagram. And we talk about a 5-step process to do that. The first one is discovery, right? The second one is analysis. The third is specification, functional design, and build. Most companies start with B. And if you want to spend 6 times as much money on your SharePoint deployment, start with B. Okay? Because what happens is you build it, then you find out it doesn't really work, then you find out you didn't really specify what you needed, then you find out you didn't really analyze what those needs were because nobody ever talked to the users. So if you want to go backwards, you can spend 6 times as much money, or if you want to go forwards, you can spend a lot less. All right, you got that? So we're going to talk about that overlap in the Venn diagram here now, specifically from the point of view of document management and something that everyone needs to know about document management. Now, there's 2 kinds of document management. Every company has certain sets of documents that may be highly regulated, that you have to treat as uber special. So they have to be managed in a really tight way. They have to be archived properly or else the government's up your nose, those kinds of things. So I call that managing documents for the sake of managing documents. Now, many of you already have systems that do that kind of thing today. You have it in place, you put it in those departments. So if you're a bank, you definitely got one of these, right? Or maybe 6. SharePoint's a little different. It's managing documents as part of your job. SharePoint is the first platform that gives you the ability to do that because you're not paying $5,000 for a single seat of Documentum, right? I'm exaggerating. It's not 5, it's $2,500, but it's still expensive, right? So SharePoint gives you the ability to do both of those things. You can collaborate, you can do all kinds of other things with it. Now, the primary rules of document management need to be applied. These are the requirements that you start out with when you're doing anything with SharePoint. You will never, ever, okay, if I went into your office and I went over to your desk and I grabbed everything that was on the desk and I walked down the hallway and I found an open office and I threw it in there, you wouldn't like that, would you? Right? Because your immediate question would be, how am I going to find that? Right? However, what I just described is exactly what SharePoint does by default. It takes everything and throws it into the nearest file cabinet, because it's using a default content type every time you create a library called document. Now, when you set up your file cabinet to put your information in there, or your users do they file everything under document? Okay. What are you looking for? Document. Okay. Which one? Is it a PowerPoint? No, I'm looking for a document. What kind of document? And here's where it gets interesting. A purchase order, an invoice for vendor number 007. Those are the things that I'm looking for. Right? That's what I mean by the content model. By default, SharePoint does not do that. When you turn on the library, it assumes that you're just going to take the stuff and you're going to throw it into the nearest available office or whatever. Okay, that's what it does by default. Now, naturally, when you want to go look for something, you don't put anything away in your house, in your garage, or anywhere without knowing how you're going to find it, right? But you need to know that SharePoint doesn't make that assumption. Its default out-of-the-box state is it doesn't care how you're going to find it, because they don't know what your rules for your business are for finding things. What is your particular application, right? Same with how to control it. That's all off too, because how do you want to control it, right? You're not going to let me arrange your garage because you're not going to find anything, right? You're not going to let me arrange the bookshelves in your library because you're not going to find the book, right? Now, in every company, nobody has the same way of organizing anything. So the first thing with SharePoint is that it kind of forces you into a common way of doing things. So answering these very basic questions is what produces the requirements for a very simple fundamental document management. So when you roll out SharePoint, you let people build libraries. This has to be baked in the cake. You need an answer to these questions, or you cannot do effective document management. If the user cannot tell you how they're going to find it, then you can't manage it. If you don't know how to control it, or they don't know how to control it, you won't be able to control it. It'll be everywhere. Expense reports will show up in everybody's email, and you see what every executive in a company makes. That control has to be there. That's not a control you can just exercise from the back end. That has to be baked into the application. You have to look at it from the business side, not from the technology side. This is what we teach in our class. This is what we call the SharePoint configuration wheel. These are all the different ways in which you can manipulate SharePoint without doing any programming. Now, you'll notice some terminology on this slide that you haven't heard anybody talk about. Well, what we did was we slugged our way through those 12,000 pages, and we grouped functions that belong together. So we don't talk about it A through Z. We talk about in terms of things that work together to allow you to perform certain kinds of configuration tasks. That's why we come up with something called global entities. Global entities are things in SharePoint that are always there but are probably not configured. In fact, I know they're not configured because out of the box, none of them are configured. So that's things like libraries, content types, document sets, metadata, web parts, and even security. Right? Those are all the things that are always operating anytime somebody's using SharePoint, but they are configured to 0. So there is no how will I find it, there is no how will I control it, there is no how will I route it. Those things all have to be added. So this is a lot of capability, a lot of features that doesn't require any kind of programming. Now let's dive a little deeper into this. You have the SharePoint repository. Anything that anybody puts into it goes into that repository. Now, the trick is, I have my end user's site or application, right? Let's say that I'm going to call that an application from now on, because it's like My Bank of America, right? So I have my application, and what I want to do is deliver stuff from the repository to that application, library, whatever it is. What are the control vehicles that I have to be able to do that? And those are all the global entities. So certainly a list in the library, right, trims the amount of information that's going to be shown in it. Now, it doesn't trim it enough to be totally relevant to the user. So you really need to deploy content types. Now, I've gone to probably about 10 sessions since I've been here. I've heard the word content type twice. Okay? Now, I'm here to tell you, as a document management expert and as a SharePoint non-MVP, doesn't live in Hawaii expert, okay, that the content type is the single most important control element in SharePoint. Okay? Now, it's a little complicated, which is why nobody talks about it. But the content type lets you determine exactly what a user is going to see in a library. It lets the company control exactly the document that they need to control. Okay? It gives you the ultimate in control over your document information. So SharePoint by default assumes that the kind of library you run is where the books are piled up in the middle of the floor, right? And when somebody returns a book to the library, they just throw it into that pile. That's very convenient for me returning a book, okay? Because I don't have to walk up to the desk and do that hard work, right? However, it's not very convenient if I'm in the philosophy section and there are no books there. So basic librarianship is an essential thing in any information management. The content type gives you that in a very powerful way. So let's dive into that. All SharePoint content is placed in a content type. There is no way to put anything in SharePoint that isn't automatically assigned a content type. So, well, wait a minute. If the content type is already there, how come my users can't find anything? How come the libraries are so disorganized? Well, there is a default content type that you don't see that is always being used. Now, we make fun of it. We call it the crap content type. So if you want to put crap into SharePoint, it's very easy to do because it's right there, right? But what I'm saying is that if something is put into SharePoint, it's automatically designed the content type. There is no way to put anything into SharePoint that does not require the use of a content type. And in order to meet that need, because architecturally that's how it's built, it has a set of default content types that it uses that you're supposed to modify, but that wasn't in the manual, okay? You're supposed to make your own document content types so that when you create a document library, the content type isn't document. It's what I said earlier. It's invoice, it's purchase order, it's expense report, right? So now I am organizing and I'm filing my information. So there's nothing you can do about that. All SharePoint content is automatically put into a content type, but you need to configure those for your business requirements. It allows you to classify and organize everything that you put into SharePoint. It's the organizational model. It's the core of the content model that I talked about earlier. It allows you to syndicate content across the enterprise. You can decide whether something should be seen by everyone, whether it should be in another farm, it should be across the world. You can syndicate it right from there. You can't do that kind of stuff with Documentum. You can't have a system in Switzerland and one in New York that effectively reconcile each other. There's a latency. It won't be instantaneous. And you have to duplicate the infrastructure that you have in New York. You have to duplicate that infrastructure in Switzerland. SharePoint makes that all go away. That by itself is enough reason to use it, right? However, if you're not going to use content types, you have no control over the information. It's a combination of object and index. I want to say it's a magic folder, but I don't want to use the word folder because it's hard enough to get users off of that concept in the first place. But let's just say it's a magical folder. And what it would do is it would know what the content is. It would understand the records policies that go along with it. It would understand the workflows that are supposed to be executed with it. So when that thing is put in that magic folder, right, that magic happens. Now, that all has to be configured. Now, it doesn't take a genius to configure that stuff. It's not hard. Okay, what it requires is a session on a whiteboard. We always say the rule number one in SharePoint is start with the whiteboard before you touch the keyboard, okay? Because a lot of bad things happen if you just go right to the keyboard. So that combination of object and index, let me put it in another way. Think of it, the fact that the properties, the information about the document, what's supposed to happen with it, and what kinds of actions should be taken with it become part of the document because it's put in a database and all the content types are wrapped around it. So it's kind of like an XML wrapper around a file. So that doesn't really matter where the file lives. You're always going to be able to find it by the properties because what you're looking for are the properties. So it doesn't matter if it's on a farm in China. It doesn't matter if it's under your feet. It doesn't matter if it's under your desk. You're going to find it the same way. That's the power of the content type. I'm going to skip this part. So let's get into it a little bit. Okay, so this is, I kind of find it refreshing because this is the actual SharePoint that I'm using now. Not the one I'm going to be using in January because we're going to switch because we have every piece of SharePoint that anybody can think of because what we do is play with it all day long. So we don't have to really do anything productive with it. So this is Office 365, and this is your basic team site, right? Now what I'm talking about here with content types works in any version of SharePoint. So the principles that I'm talking about here would be useful in any instance of SharePoint. Over here are my libraries, is my typical ugly template. Usually users are allowed to create a new document library, right? Or your department would have that capability. So you might not see everything else there. Then you got your library, you name it, you should provide a description. Then you got a bunch of stuff that I don't know what it does and I don't care. And then here's my library, okay? Now, this is a default library. This is what SharePoint wants to do out of the box. And if you don't see several problems with this right from the get-go, okay, you better start thinking more about it. Because from a document management point of view, what you have just done is commit a document crime. If you're trying to have users manage documents with SharePoint, you should never allow them to do this, okay? That should not be what happens. The default library that they should be creating at this point should have already been configured to meet those minimal needs of how will I find it, how will I secure it, how will I route it, and I forgot what the others were, okay, those 5 points, right? There's my library, and I've got some very useful column data here. Type of document, right? After all, when I'm looking for something, my first instinct is to say, was that a PDF or a PowerPoint? No, my first instinct is the presentation that I gave at SharePoint 2012. That's what I'm looking for. It's a description. That's not on this page. There's other useful information like modified and modified by. After all, that is, very important stuff. I also particularly like the ability to RSS feed my library out to everybody in the universe. That is a really handy feature because I want my mom to be able to see the documents that I put in here. So what I'm talking about now is how to perform an undo of this. So I'm not saying that users have to do what I'm about to do, and I'm not saying that, that you have to do what I'm about to do. What you should have done is configure this, or whoever, I don't know who you are, but whoever's responsible for this should have configured it. So this is a way to configure it. It is not necessarily the way. So that's why I say it's an undo. If you have libraries like this, here's how you undo them. So you click on the library settings, and you've got all this, important stuff. There's a lot of links here. Isn't this terrific? General settings, permissions and management. You've got the columns, okay? Now, pay attention to the breadcrumbs here because we are talking about document library settings. These are library settings. These are settings for the library. That means that you can create and specify columns for the library. And then you can put a document in it, and those columns then go with that document until that document is surfaced in another library. Those columns don't go with it because the columns are for the library, not for the object. So rule number 1 is never allow people to build a document library just using document library columns. Because if I have my invoice processing page and I have library columns, and then I have a finance clerk that has their own library that's going to be looking at that same document, those columns that I created don't go with the document. So that's where you have people indexing the same thing 97 different times. You don't want that. That's why you want to use a content type, because the columns in the content type go with the document. Okay? So content type equals document type. What types of documents are people using with? That's what should be happening in this library from the get-go. What kinds of documents? Say, invoices, purchase orders, letters of credit, all of those things, business people use those words to define the documents that they work with. The management aspect of that should be already reflected in the library when they create it. If finance builds a new library in their finance site collection, the content types that finance uses should be there for them to use by default. You shouldn't have to do what I'm showing you. You can determine how the library is going to look out of the box. So the very first thing that you need to do in this undo is you need to go to advanced settings. Now here's a little hint for you. Just about everything you need to do is under advanced settings. That's like a rule of thumb. What's under advanced settings? Well, under advanced settings is allow management of content types. Now, wait a minute, Ray. You said a minute ago that nothing can be put into SharePoint without it being in a content type. So isn't that already on? No. It's only on for the default content type, which is the document content type, or that I'm calling the crap content type. Right? So we want to turn that on. There's a whole bunch of other options that we have here. Now you see that, in fact, there was a content type all the time. Ha-ha! It was called document. It didn't show up in the previous library settings, but it shows up now. There it is. The document content type is what's being used when something is put in. Okay? So now what we want to do is create new content types for this library. And let's say that this is a finance library because that's what we called it, right? So we go over here to our site settings, and we are going to look for where we go to build content types. Anybody know where you go to build content types? It's very logical. It's under galleries, okay, where it belongs. What's a gallery, okay? And about halfway down is something called the site content type. Right? Now, the single most important thing that you need to know about document management with SharePoint is buried under galleries in content type under the advanced settings for a library. Okay? That doesn't make much sense to me, but okay, it is what it is. Right? This is what we're going to do. So now we see that we have content types here already, and that we already have some document content types that are on by default. And they're very useful ones, like form, okay? How many forms does your company have? How many forms do your users use in your company, do you think? Right? Lots. Are they all called form? Right? Or is it job application form? You know? Or is it change order request form? Or is it, you know, HIPAA form? Is it any of those things? They all have names. So what you're supposed to do, and what nobody told you, is that you're supposed to use these prototypical content types and turn them into the relevant document types that you have in your company. Once you've done that, they can be automatically applied when somebody creates a new library, and those will be their choices instead of the default ones. In fact, SharePoint has an advanced feature called the Content Type Hub, which is probably the most important thing that you need to do if you're going to effectively manage documents in the company, because that allows you to develop content types up here, apply the metadata here, and that when it's inherited down into different site collections, people can add new columns, but they can't change the ones that are already there. So that is instantaneous document control from the get-go. Now we want to create a new content type. We're going to call that vendor invoices. We're going to make a new group called finance, because that's what we're going to use, because we're not only going to make an invoice content type, we're going to make a purchase order, whatever document that any finance clerk is going to work with in this library, apart from their own nonsense. What they're going to work with in this library that's company matter is going to fit into one of those content types. Now, I have a lot of settings, right? I did say it was a magic folder, so there's a whole lot of things that can happen when a document is checked in using this content type. So workflows can happen, policies can be executed, a whole bunch of really cool stuff that allows automatic management across the entire enterprise can be performed right here, just knowing what the settings are. Now, it's largely ignored because if you don't go out and talk to how people are going to use these libraries, or you're not thinking about the library as an application, you're not going to think of those requirements. Therefore, most of those settings will not be used, but they all should be used. Now, you've got columns, and you can see that we still have the default column of title, right, and type, and all that stuff. We only have one piece of metadata for this particular content type, and it's optional, which is useless, right? So might as well not have made it. So what we need to do now is create some basic metadata columns. So pretend for a minute that we are developing this content type in the hub. That means it's available across all of SharePoint. We can determine that, right? So that anybody builds a finance library, any document that goes into that finance library is going to always have a minimal amount of metadata that goes with it. It's a one-time pain, right? And that's it. I mean, there is such a thing as over-indexing. You know, you don't want 350 fields of metadata for a document being checked into the library. So this is where you have to think all you really need is some unique information. So unique information is a vendor number. If I'm ever looking for an invoice from a vendor, whatever that guy's number is, or whatever that vendor's, that's how I'm going to find it. So that's an essential piece of metadata, because if I'm looking for every invoice that we ever got from vendor number 007, that's how I'm going to find it. And I will find them all, right? So that's an essential thing. So I'm going to make that column a number. I'm going to make a new set of columns called finance columns, because I may reuse them in other content types. So I don't want to make vendor number again when I make a purchase order content type. I already have the column. I'm just going to reuse the column that I just made. Right? So you don't want to make a new vendor number column every time you create a new finance content type. Then you have some other options that you can, this is particularly powerful one, is the validation of input. Right? That's very important, so you can make sure that what somebody types in there is a valid vendor number. There's a variety of ways that you can use that capability to do that. I'm also going to want invoice amount, right? Because when the customer's on the phone and I'm in front of my SharePoint library, I'm going to say, how much was that invoice for? And that will give me an instantaneous way to find that, right? Now, you know, when I use dollars, there's a lot of things that SharePoint can do. One of them is you can convert that to euros if they're looking at a European site, right? There's a lot of things like that. You can validate the input, that it's got to be dollars and cents. Some accountant types are nuts about the number of digits on the other end of the decimal point. The third thing that I want, or the last thing that I absolutely have to have there, is the invoice date. What's the date and time, right, that I got the invoice? So those are three criteria that I'm always going to want. I can make that today's date. Now nobody has to type anything because it's the date of submission, and that's less keystrokes for the user. One-time pain for them when they upload it, they have to answer that question. But then when they're working with the file, they don't have to do that anymore. And now you have a somewhat organized library. Now, SharePoint also assumes that none of the work that we just did is anything you want to use. I particularly enjoy this feature. So we went through and made all these columns, but they're optional. They're not required. Well, what's the point of putting metadata columns in a content type if they're not required? So now we have to go through some additional steps of making those required, and that is simply clicking on them and making them required. Now, obviously, this is an undo, right? You're undoing something in order to fix a library. The best way to do this is to have these parameters already loaded in. And the best way you do that is you ask the users, how will I find it? How will I control it? How will I route it? Okay, that's how it's built. So we go through all that. We see that they're now required, and we see that, that they're right there. And now we are chagrined that we still see the document, that stubborn little thing, is the default content type. Now we have to go through another process of taking that invoice content type and making it mandatory, and the first one, you can have multiple content types in the library, up to 256, I believe. Then we have to look at the columns. We have to apply those columns to the library, because while they're in the content type, we want them, instead of modified, and modified by. So we want to activate the columns also. So this presentation is available. If you go to the Digitech booth, you can take this thing home with you, okay? They'll send you an email with this file, and you can walk through it in the private sanctuary of your own home or office. So now we're going to apply the invoice content type to this library. This is the window that does that. We hit the Add button. Now it's there. Then we're going to go and take the columns, and we're going to turn the columns on in the library views. So now it's a default content type. The remaining steps are to take the columns, which is invoice and amount and all that, and apply those to the library columns. So when somebody fires up that library, they're going to be able to see that. You can also adjust the library views in terms of how each column is sorted. They're very powerful options right there to make this a very warm and fuzzy kind of library for users in the finance department. So now we have all that there. I did put one column in there called fooling around with library columns. Ignore that. We see invoice amount, invoice date, title, vendor number, all that stuff is there. Now we're going to add a document. We're going to add a document. I go out to my desktop. I choose the file. That's the kind of trash I read. It's about agile development. So I'm going to upload that to my site, and I'm asked the questions. Those are the required fields. This is the one-time pane that I'm talking about. So upon first upload of an invoice, that is what you're asked to do. So now I'm going to fill all that in, and I'm going to save it out to the site, and there it is. Now I have a useful library. I can look at the columns, and I can instantaneously find the invoice that the vendor is on the phone wanting to know when that's going to be paid. I could also execute a wide variety of workflows on that to get the approval of the invoice, to have it come back to the library, be flagged as approved. Use your imagination. There's a ton of stuff you can do because you have something very definitive to use to manipulate. You have the vendor invoice content type, and you can perform all those actions on it because the system itself, SharePoint itself, can find that instantaneously. All right, that's a lot harder to do if you're searching for stuff. So, how many of you people still have paper? Does anybody still use paper in their business? You've heard about that technology, right? Okay. So, when we talk about document management, everybody thinks about the PDF that wasn't attached to an email. Now, if I've gone through all the work of making this particular library, right, I have a framework. I can use that. I can put my paper documents into that same framework, except for that I need something that does the scanning, right, and that works with SharePoint in order to recognize that framework that I set up and work directly with it. So what I've chosen here is to use a product called PaperVision Desktop. So that's at booth 446. And if you give them your business card, they'll give you this application. So, I mean, they'll actually give you a full working version of it, but they'll also give you my slide deck, which is a lot more important. Anyway, so what you can do with this product is you can install scanning at every desktop where you have people who still get paper invoices, let's say, since we're staying within that finance paradigm, who still get paper invoices. I don't have to stand up a server. All the functionality of putting that piece of paper into SharePoint can be done at that particular desktop. There's no server. It's fully featured. Everything you need to OCR to do anything, to create jobs where people just push one button and it executes a variety of scanning functions that they're not even aware of are happening. It's all configured directly into that system. It's very simple for the user to use. Very powerful for the administrator to administrate. That's all good stuff, right? All right, so now we go back to our library. We come at it from a different view. And we see that there are these additional documents that are in the library that are indexed in the exact same way as the framework that we made earlier. How did that happen? Well, obviously, we scanned the paper, but how did it get into the library, and how did it match up those fields? Well, it did that automatically. So while I had to manually index an electronic invoice, I can automatically index a paper invoice because the software that I'm using is smart enough to do that and map it into the content type directly. So you see it's got the same columns. Obviously, we scanned a piece of paper. Now take a look. See, to the left of that image, you can see the same content fields that we have in a framework. That's because this particular software product works directly with the SharePoint framework to get that information from SharePoint. So as soon as somebody executes a scan, the columns that they need to populate are there. And so they can manually type them in, or we can automate that process and automatically put them in. Now, there they are. How did that happen? How did we do that? Well, this is a preset in the program. When you first turn it on, you point it to the library. It identifies all the content types are there. It identifies all the columns that are there, and it remembers those. Okay? So now it knows how to get into SharePoint and how you want to organize the stuff that you scan. Then it gives you the ability to automatically map those fields to fields that the program is using when it's extracting information from the image that it's scanning. So you set all that up, you hit the auto map, and the columns appear next to the columns that are in PaperVision Desktop. So now I've got that there. But here's what always happens, right? Damn, I forgot a column. I just spent 40 minutes to show you how to add another column to a content type. Do you really want to go back when you're scanning this? Do you really want to go back and do all that again just to add another column in SharePoint? Well, with this particular product, you don't have to. You can add the column from here. In fact, you can define any number of columns that you want. Now, we said earlier that the invoice content type may be coming out of a hub. It probably should be coming out of a hub. And the company has made that content type and said there's always 3 pieces of information we want about every invoice. But we realize that you departments are going to want to add some of your own. So as long as you're using that out of the hub, right, we'll let you add columns in your own site collection. PaperVision Desktop recognizes that and gives you the ability to do that without leaving the app. You can do it directly from PaperVision Desktop. So we have that barcode there. That barcode has important information in my department. So I need a new field called barcode. I don't want to go through all the hoo-ha of going through SharePoint to do that. I want to be able to do that from here. So that can be part of the job definition that you determine what people are going to be able to do when they scan. But you're doing it from here. You're not doing it from inside SharePoint. So we want to assign that to the index. We also realize that this vendor, Extras Inc., has many different locations. And while the company doesn't really care, the vendor is the vendor, in my department, I want to know, was that the New Jersey people, or was that the Maryland people, or who was that? So I want that column too, because when I go back to my library, I'm looking for invoices, I need that additional information. So I can create that column as well, and I can assign it. I can make a new index field called address. And again, I can map that directly to SharePoint, and the product will go out and create those columns in the content types in SharePoint. Now I hit the scan button. It does its voodoo, and the new invoice is there, including the additional information, which it automatically took out of the barcode, created the field, put it in the field, automatically took the address and put it in there. Okay? So once you create a framework in SharePoint for how you're going to index documents, and you have that framework there, with products like this, you can put all your paper into that same framework because it recognizes the framework. See, that's the trick, right? And it does everything that you have to do scanning-wise, which is not that trivial, like being able to read a particular line out of an image, being able to translate a barcode, allowing you to make different configurations for different kinds of invoices that you get from different vendors because they're not all the same, right? But they could just be pushing a button to execute a job. Invoices from blah, and all this stuff happens. And it's in their SharePoint, and they don't have to think about it. So a real-world plan is that realize that you're allowing users to build applications, not sites. So therefore, you need to have requirements right from the get-go. You need to take the user requirements and map them into the SharePoint technology. You need to have the content types in advance. You should create a hub. You need to know what the key metadata requirements are. This isn't rocket science. All you really need to get started is one variable. Answer the question for me. If you put this document in a library, how will you find it? And they'll say, by vendor number. Okay. So we got one. How will you route it? Well, it's got to go to Mo, Shemp, and Larry for approval. Okay, well, that's my workflow, right? What else do I have to do? Well, since this is a top secret black box project for Boeing, we have to make that a record. Well, that can be applied to the content type also. So you have all the control parameters. So as long as you can get 5 answers from users, how will I find it? How will I route it? How will I control it? One answer is good enough. You're on the way to doing it the right way, right? Now, you can obviously modify that on the fly, and if you're scanning, they can modify it quite a bit. It's a relatively simple thing to do. All right. Anybody have any questions, comments, jeers, observations? Yes? Okay, the question was, when you add a new field, does it go back and add that field to previous? No. It's a day forward. You can programmatically do that, but configuration-wise, it is a day forward proposition. From the day you add it, everything else will have that in it, right? From anything that you scanned or put in or uploaded previously does not have that new column attached to it. But you can write some code to do that if you need to. Most people find that you really don't. New criteria come along all the time. You had a question? Somebody adjust that mic for the young lady, please. You mean in terms of aging? It's my Hendrix thing again. In terms of aging things out of a library, those are part of the settings when you configure a content type. You can put that in there. So I didn't show it to you, but there is another screen that says keep it for XYZ period and then move it to an archive. Was that your question? I can't really hear you.
Does it notify the user when it's going to move it?
It can. It can. You can do that notification with a workflow. Okay, you can do the notification in a variety of different ways. So the really quick way to do it would be to just put a workflow in there that says, these documents have been moved, and send them an email that does that. Or you can get fancy and you can flag them as about to be moved, make a new column that flags the documents. These are about to be archived. And then at X period of time, you can actually execute that. I said I couldn't tell you all document management, right? Because that would take more than an hour. But that's a very important thing to do. Anybody else have any other questions, comments, jeers, observations? Yes? Why do you want to do that? Well, this is like a lot of SharePoint questions. The can you do X in SharePoint, fill in the blank here? The answer is always yes. That's the problem with it, right? So is that the right way to do it? Is that the best practice to do it? I don't think so. But can you do it? Yeah, you can. Because you can do anything. That's part of the issue. Any other questions?